Still, isn't it terrifying to think that if you get married, your chance of failure is 35% and the chance of success is only 65% at the most? Even if we go with that number, isn't that still very, very scary? Isn't it high enough that it should dissuade anyone from attempting it?
I think it's safe to say Matt Walsh is not a big fan of the so-called red pill movement or its advocates like Pearl Davis. I have to confess, I don't know a whole lot about Pearl Davis outside of a few random clips online and what Matt is responding to here. So nothing I say is really in approval or condemnation of anything she has to say. I don't know what she has to say in any detail. But let's watch. Matt has some very interesting responses to what he perceives as an attack on the institution of marriage. Let's break this down.
Some right-wing influencers with legions of young, mostly male fans have decided that men should abandon marriage and family life and go their own way. And these influencers, many of whom consider themselves a part of the so-called red pill movement, pretend to despise feminists and yet have essentially arrived at the same conclusion as feminists, which is that we should give up on the family. The two sides hate marriage almost as much as they hate each other. Now, one of these influencers is a woman named Pearl Davis, who has garnered a relatively large following on YouTube and various social media platforms. She's in her mid-20s, single and childless, and yet full of opinions about modern marriage and family life, a subject that she has no personal insight into whatsoever. She spent the past few days on the internet complaining about quote-unquote tradcons like myself, who, she says, promote the nuclear family despite not understanding what it's really like. Yes, we men who actually have wives and children don't know what it's like to be married, but a woman who is not married and has no children does know what it's like. In one of her tweets, she wrote, quote, "The tradcons push marriage because they aren't old enough to know better. They don't know the reality of what they're pushing." This is accompanied by a picture of myself, Ben Shapiro, Michael Knowles. We aren't old enough to know better and don't know the reality of what we're pushing, yet a woman who is younger than us and single does know better and does understand this reality.
I think this can be analogized with the idea that someone who owns a business cannot have a valid insight on the difficulties of owning a business unless they own a billion-dollar business. Now, obviously, that sounds like a ridiculous claim because anybody who owns a business is already in the weeds as far as dealing with the difficulties of owning a business. The fact that they don't get to that billion-dollar status says nothing about their experience as a business owner. It might say something about the skill, it might say something about the luck involved, but it doesn't say anything about the experience itself. And to bring that back to marriage, every one of us who is of dating age and have dated know the difficulty of dealing with people that we are trying to court or trying to get into a relationship with. And that experience is something that doesn't just change just because we've gotten the law to recognize and certify that relationship. In many ways, there are so many people who are not married and have so much more experience about what it takes to make for a successful relationship than those who are actually married. And on the flip side, there's a lot of people who are married who just jump into it very recklessly because they're trying to follow some tradition. One need not even be in a relationship or have actively dated even to have such insights, because at bottom, relationships are relationships, regardless of whether they are in a romantic context, a business context. They might vary in their unique ways, obviously, and we might prefer one over the other through our natural instincts. In other words, we prefer to have romantic relationships far more than we do to have, say, a business relationship, for example. But nonetheless, they're all built on the same framework of trying to figure out a person's wants, a person's desires, how we can compromise. And all of these experiences are ubiquitous amongst relationships, regardless of what context we are having those relationships. And as many people are painfully aware of, it doesn't take being married to have the experience of having kids either. So for us to criticize marriage is really at the heart of it, a criticism on the likelihood that you're not going to maintain a long-term indefinite relationship with somebody, as marriage seems to suggest, till death do us apart.
Another post, she goes on to say that marriage is a terrible deal for men, and she later explains, quote, "Would you ever sign a contract that fails 75% of the time where your business partner is paid to break the contract? Why would you encourage men to sign that contract until the terms are fixed?" Now, you may be surprised to learn that marriages fail at a rate of 75%. The figure that people like this normally use is 50%. And the claim that 50% of marriages end in divorce is already spurious, and we'll have more on that in a moment, but 75%? I was wondering where that number came from, so I scrolled down and I saw something that she reposted from an alleged lawyer who said this, quote, "It's not 50-50, that only accounts for divorces. Another 25% on the negative side for miserable men trapped in cheaper to keep her marriages, unwilling to risk financial destruction and loss of their children. 75% chance of a devastatingly bad outcome is just a bad plan. No sane person would enter into a commercial contract on such terms." Now, I did ask him where he got this 75% figure from, and he wouldn't say. Apparently, the magic statistic fairy came and whispered it in his ear. Now, for her part, Pearl later tweeted a picture of Pierce Brosnan with his wife of 20 years, and she questioned whether the marriage counts as successful since Brosnan's wife has put on some weight at the age of 60. So apparently, even if they're happy and have remained married for 2 decades, they still might fall into that 75% failure rate because they have not both remained in supermodel condition into their 60s.
In full disclosure, I think I should say that I'm not advocating for either side here. I'm not saying we should marry or we should not marry. I'm simply calling out what I see as inconsistencies in the arguments that Matt Walsh is making. I'm happy to be swayed by either side on this debate, which is a very interesting one, but I'm simply not buying what Matt Walsh is selling so far. This post about Pierce Brosnan and his wife, who I guess is a little out of shape, maybe relatively speaking, compared to her younger self, but we all expect age to take a toll on us eventually. I think the point that Pearl was trying to make here is that guys tend to get into relationships, or married especially, dependent on the attraction that we have towards that person, more so than women who tend to seek out things that offer security, like financial stability, status and height even. And so I think given that, Pearl is asking, if you're a guy who prioritizes looks as much as we guys tend to do amongst the other variables, are you okay with the person that you're with losing those looks when age finally comes calling? And I think this is a valid question to ask, just as it would be a valid question for a woman who's thinking about marriage to ask herself that if there's a possibility that this guy that I'm getting involved with is going downhill, financially speaking, and is going to offer me less security, is that someone that I want to be with? I think these are both valid things to consider when trying to get into relationships. While they might seem superficial, they are obviously very important factors when it comes to mate selection. And so I think it's very valid for someone to consider the possibility that they might eventually feel shortchanged in the future, and to use that in their analysis of whether to get married or whether to promise somebody and to commit to somebody for the long term.
This debate on social media brought out the rest of the marriage skeptical crowd on the right. A bunch of these red pill influencers decided to hop on an emergency Zoom call and spend 2 hours talking about me and the rest of the Daily Wire crew and our reckless promotion of society's most fundamental institution. Now, there's one clip here that you should see. This is apparently a divorce lawyer who says that the failure rate for marriage is not 50% and it's not 75%. It is, in fact, even higher. Listen.
I think marriage can be successful, of course. It's just not something that's as scalable as we as a society are trying to pretend it is. Marriage is, and I've said this 100 times and I'll say it 100 more, marriage is like the lottery. You are probably not going to win, okay? You're probably not going to win. Don't make that your 401k. You're probably not going to win. But if you win, what you win is so great that I don't blame you for buying a ticket and trying. I personally don't buy lottery tickets. But when somebody says, yeah, I played a lottery, hey man, somebody's got to win. And you know what? As long as you're not blowing money that you need for food or to put shoes on your kids' feet, you're not hurting anybody, go out, give it a try. So I always tell people, listen, marriage, when it works, when you have somebody who's married 20 plus years and they're still crazy about each other, that is the exception, not the rule. But when you do it, it's phenomenal. It's phenomenal. So why not buy the ticket, take the ride, but have a prenup? Wear a seatbelt, guys. You can be a safe driver, but wear a seatbelt.
You know what I don't understand about the way they're characterizing marriage, both Matt Walsh and the lawyer who is being addressed here, is that they both are speaking as though marriage is somehow going to change a relationship. Like the quality of a relationship does not depend on you signing a piece of paper or deciding to call each other husband and wife. As far as I'm concerned, that is simply a formality. It's basically labels on something that is either working out or not working out. If someone decides to get married and they're in a horrible relationship, the fact that they're getting married says nothing about the quality of relationships.
So a happy marriage, he says, is like winning the lottery. And the thing about the lottery is that almost everybody loses. This is a perfect summation of how this entire club views marriage and the message that they're sending to young men in particular. Sure, it can be great, they concede, but only if you're insanely lucky. Everybody else is screwed. This is a rather bleak view of marriage, and thankfully, it's also nonsense. First of all, the claim that marriage isn't scalable is obviously ridiculous because marriage has served as the bedrock of human society since time immemorial. It has already happened at the scale of civilization for thousands of years. Now, the divorce lawyers come along and say that, this thing that society's been doing forever, turns out it doesn't work. Unless you're the one in a million. It's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous claim.
I'm not sure scalability was the right word for the lawyer to use. I don't know if that's actually what he was going for or if he might have meant something else, but my guess is because obviously marriage is scalable. Marriage is scalable, as Matt Walsh said, in a civilizational sense, in a generational sense. And so I think the point the lawyer was trying to make here is that for something that is as scalable as marriage, something that is as widespread as marriage, you would expect there to be far more greater odds than the ones that we see. I think the lawyer is expressing his, perplexity at the fact that something that has such a high failure rate is attracting so many people who seem to either underweight that probability or they simply are ignorant about it. And that does seem like something that people should be very aware of when getting into marriages. The fact that something has been institutionalized and has been so popular for time immemorial should not be the only reason why someone jumps headlong into this enterprise. One thing I haven't seen Matt do yet is point out any intrinsic benefit of marriage. He might have done that in other videos, but I haven't seen that yet. All the strongest argument he seems to have made so far is that because marriage has been so scalable, to use that word again, throughout different generations and cultures, that somehow that justifies it. I'm not sure if that's his claim here, but that seems to be the most strong argument he's made so far in terms of justifying marriage. And we can see upon just a little reflection that that falls apart when we start to consider things like slavery, which amongst other practices, we have done away with to our benefit. And something like slavery was also practiced throughout different cultures, throughout different generations. So it really begs the question that how much do we want to retain a practice simply because of its traditional hold on us, And especially in a time when technology has unencumbered us from a lot of the social and environmental pressures that forced us into, or forced many different cultures, maybe not everybody, but forced many people into traditions such as marriages, because those were things that were very beneficial given the climate that a lot of people lived in those times. Of course, there's also things like honor killing and arranged marriages and so many other practices that we are happy to have done away with, at least in many parts of the civilized world. When considering whether to engage in such practices, I think it's far better to analyze the costs and benefits in our present context than it is to try to validate them based on historical context.
Now, what about the failure rate of marriages in our culture? We've heard 50%, we've heard 75%. We just heard that they fail at a rate similar to the rate that people lose the lottery, which would mean higher than 99%, a lot higher. Yet, these kinds of astronomical odds are not based in anything but the doom and gloom speculations of the people inventing them. There is no evidence that having a happy marriage is as unlikely as winning the lottery, or that 75% of marriages end in misery. And what about the 50% number? Well, this is at least is a familiar statistic. It's something that you've probably heard before. 50% of marriages end in divorce. It's familiar, but it is bogus. And one way that you know that it's bogus is that people have been claiming that 50% of marriages end in divorce since I was a kid. I've been hearing that my whole life. And that would mean that divorce rates are static across time. But of course, that isn't the case. In fact, we know that divorce rates have gone down in recent years. So where does the 50% figure come from? Apparently, it's a holdover from the 1980s, which is when people first started citing that statistic. It's not true today. And it's actually not clear that it was true even in the 80s either. So what is the actual divorce rate? It's a little bit hard to determine. Probably our best guess is based on U.S. Census data, which according to the most recent figures, says that about 35% of American adults who have been married have been divorced. So it's not exactly going to give us a precisely scientific figure of what the divorce rate is, but it's as close as we're going to get, 35%. And 35% is high. I mean, it's way too high. It's not 50%, though, and it's not 75%, and it's not 99%. And it's definitely not lottery odds.
I'm trying really hard not to get sucked into the statistics here because I'm sure it gets extremely murky extremely quickly. But what exactly do we even measure the success of a marriage by? I'm guessing Matt Walsh is using the longevity of it, how long a couple has been married for. And for one, that's problematic because after 20 years, if they end up divorcing, do we consider that a successful marriage? I think most people might consider that a successful marriage just given the uncommon amount of time. But it's worth remembering here that divorce rates say nothing about the quality or success of marriages. Because we all know couples who are married who are just going through the roughest times, and we do not envy either one of their positions with the relationships that they're having with each other. And imagine how much more of that is going on behind the scenes. Even the ones in the public is enough to give us pause on just how successful marriages are, let alone what is going on behind the curtains. We all know couples that seem perfect when out in public or on social media, but in reality, they probably should not be with each other. And sometimes unexpectedly, they break up with each other and everybody is in shock. But the fact is that these numbers, 35%, 50%, whatever you want to call it, even 35%, which is the number that Matt Walsh feels more comfortable with, that alone in itself is a high enough number as far as divorce rates go. If you compound that with the fact that not all marriages are successful or have the quality that we might hope they have just because they're married, then it becomes a whole different set of probability that you're working with when you're thinking about getting into marriage, and one that is worth taking into very careful consideration before jumping into.
Still, isn't it terrifying to think that if you get married, your chance of failure is 35% and the chance of success is only 65% at the most? Even if we go with that number, isn't that still very, very scary? Isn't it high enough that it should dissuade anyone from attempting it? The answer to that question is no. And here's why. If the divorce rate is 35%, or even if it's 50%, it does not follow that your own particular marriage has a 35 or 50% chance of failure. Now, I'm not saying that you should be cocky or reckless or that you should see yourself as invincible. I am saying that you shouldn't, on the other extreme, see yourself as passive debris floating helplessly on the tide of statistical likelihoods. Because you are an individual. Your marriage is an individual thing. And its chances of failure are not set by society at large. So here's an example to illustrate what I mean. And this is really, really important to understand because as marriage rates fall, and those are falling, the thing that convinces so many people to not marry in the first place are numbers like this. And this misconception that, well, look at the divorce rate, and that is my own specific chance of getting divorced. And I'm here to tell you that's not how it works. So I think this illustrates it. The obesity rate in the United States is over 40%. Does that mean that your own chances of becoming obese are 40%? No, it doesn't. Your chances might be 5%. They might be practically zero, or they might be quite a bit higher than 40%. That's because obesity is the result of behavior and choices. If you do not engage in the behavior or make the choices that lead to obesity, you will not become obese. The fact that 40% of people around you are fat does not mean that you automatically have a 40% obesity risk. Now let's take another example. Car accidents. Americans get into car accidents at a certain rate. I'm not sure what the rate is. It doesn't matter for our purposes. What does matter is that your own individual chance of getting into a car accident is not the same as every other driver on the road. The people who compile statistics will say things like, motorists have an X% chance of getting into a collision. But you are not just a generic motorist. You are an individual. Now, you can never bring your own chance of dying in a fiery car wreck down to zero. But if you're a responsible driver, then obviously your chances of getting into an accident are much lower than the chances of someone who is not responsible. All of those stupid drivers who don't understand the basic rules of the road and like to tweet and eat while they drive and everything else, they're inflating the numbers for everyone. They're also making the roads more dangerous for everyone. They are actually actively making your own chances of getting into a car accident higher because the roads are filled with stupid people. But your chances are not as high as their chances. You do not share their level of risk unless you're as dumb as they are. Because again, you are an individual, not a mere statistic. So what about marriage? It's true that even if you do everything right, things can still fall apart if your spouse doesn't follow that program. Now, if you both do everything right, or even most things right, then your chance of divorce is basically zero. But you can do everything on your end, and maybe your spouse doesn't do the same, and then it falls apart anyway, and that happens, and it's terrible, but it happens. It's also true that there are many, many things you can do in your marriage and before your marriage to make it much more secure than the average. Obvious things. Like you can marry someone who shares your same fundamental values. Not everyone does that. In fact, a lot of people don't. A lot of people go into marriages knowing ahead of time that they're marrying someone who doesn't share their fundamental values. Their chances of divorce are going to be somewhere much higher than yours if you don't make that basic entry-level mistake that they have made. You can do other things. Like you can state from the outset that you both in principle don't believe in divorce and won't consider it as a viable option for solving any marital difficulties you may experience down the line. You can have a strong and shared faith. You can establish from the beginning a habit of honest communication. You can make time for each other. You can continue to date, even or especially as your lives get busier and you start having kids and so on. You can make a strong effort to be patient with and grateful to each other. You can take care of your body and your appearance. You can do all these things and more. Now, I'm not saying that if you do all of this, it will bring your divorce chance down to zero. I'm not denying that there are plenty of people out there who did all this, at least on their own end, and yet still ended up divorced. That's not my point. My point is that the divorce rate doesn't take any of that into account. The people who take none of these basic steps are lumped in with the people who do all of it, and we're supposed to believe that both groups have an equal chance of marital failure. That's just not true.
It's one thing to say that people who are in successful relationships or marriages have checked these boxes, but it's very different and not as obvious to say that people who check these boxes are in successful relationships. Let me illustrate that with riding a bike, for example. Someone could tell you that in order to ride a bike successfully, all you have to do is check the box of putting your feet on the pedal and propelling forward, and voila, you're riding the bike. As though somehow the mere knowledge of how to ride a bike should automatically translate into the very complex actions that it takes to successfully ride a bike. So every successful rider might know to put their feet on the pedal and to propel forward and to balance and do all of these things that it takes to make a successful rider. But not everybody who knows to do that is a successful writer. It takes far more than simply knowing to check certain boxes to be successful, especially when considering something as insanely complex as human-to-human interactions. Now, he does go on to caveat by saying that doing these things does not automatically make your probability of success 100%. But again, the real question is, how do you even know you are doing these things when everybody else is so convinced that they are doing things the right way until hindsight, the 2020 vision of hindsight, finally disabuses them of that illusion? The idea that we are individuals and not statistics does make sense until you start to consider that most of us consider ourselves to be exempt from such statistics until we become a part of those statistics. Many people are convinced that because they work harder or are smarter, that they're going to defy the odds when it comes to starting a business, or that they are better judges of character and so their marriages and relationships are going to be more successful. But the difference between these statistics and other statistics like those of obesity is that with obesity, the X factor is known. It is pretty clear what causes obesity, from lifestyle choices to even the more complicated variables like genetics. But for many other statistics that we might try to exempt ourselves from based on our individual prowess, we do not have the first clue what makes one person who's hardworking end up a billionaire while another person with the same qualities end up grinding for the rest of their lives, or what makes one great artist turn out to be Van Gogh and another great artist to be someone we never heard about. It's that X factor, when there are infinite variables that transcend our ability to discern or forecast the future. Or put another way, when luck is such a huge determinant of picking the winners and the losers, the prudent thing to do if we still want to take risks is to do so knowing that we could easily be a part of those statistics, not assuming that we are the exceptions, as we are all happy to do. All of these examples and checkboxes that Matt Walsh has are also things that people who are the exception are bound to have, because there's this sense of false certainty about what it takes to be successful, what it takes for them to have been successful. It's not unlike someone like Jeff Bezos saying, well, duh, if you want to become a successful millionaire, all you have to do is wake up at 2 a.m. every morning, make sure that your business partners shower 5 times a day, and so on. When in reality, there are thousands and thousands of other people who are doing the same things, checking the same boxes, and not being as successful. It's the survivor bias, where the most successful people, or the survivors, are those who garner the most attention when everybody else who did not survive is not known about. So there's this false sense of security and an underweighting of probabilities when it comes to deciding exactly how much chances we have at being successful at something, especially if we are the survivor ourselves. To illustrate with an analogy, imagine there's a plane that's about to crash. There's 100 people on board and they all get on their knees and start praying fervently for their God to save them, and only one of them ends up surviving. Now, this survivor has the story that in order to survive a plane crash, all you have to do is get down on your knees and pray. But the fact is that 99 other people did the exact same thing and failed at it, but we never heard their stories. We never heard these checkboxes that they did satisfy that still did not work out very well for them. The real question is, how many people are satisfying these checkboxes and still unsuccessful, not those who are successful? And that is a very difficult thing to figure out. But it does encourage us to be far less eager to put ourselves in that survivor category prematurely, and to be more realistic about what we can expect when, embarking on risky ventures like marriage.
Now, I don't deny that there are real serious problems with marriage in our society. The so-called red pill people and others, they raise totally legitimate and important points on that end. We need drastic reform, abolish no-fault divorce. The entire family court system has to be torn down and rebuilt. The system is stacked against men in many ways that are extremely unfair and have ruined countless lives. So let's fight for those reforms, absolutely. But this systemic problem is not going to be solved today or tomorrow or next week. Abolishing no-fault divorce is just the beginning of reforming the system. Lawmakers in a small number of red states have only just started to seriously consider that idea, which is merely step one. So we're a long way off from fixing the system. It took decades to get us here. It will take decades to get us out at best. Anyone who tells you anything else is selling you something. They're selling you a bill of goods. This is a decade-long, long-term struggle. The question is, what are young men, young people in general, supposed to do in the meantime? And this is where the red pill becomes more of a hazy, foggy, ambiguous pill. They have no answer. They simply shout about reforms that are needed, yet have nothing to say to the young men in our culture today who will be old, if not dead, by the time the system is fixed, if it's ever fixed at all. What are these young men supposed to do right now? What kind of life would you have them lead right now, today? The answer, it appears, is that an entire generation of young men, if not multiple generations, should skip marriage while we wait for the system to improve. But this is not a viable solution. It's not a solution at all. It's a surrender. You're asking entire generations to give up their bloodline, their legacy, their chance of finding the transcendent joy and meaning that family life can provide. You're asking them to give up on themselves and on civilization itself For thousands of years, human beings have always understood that their most basic purpose and obligation was to form families and have children. And yet you're telling these young men to ignore this calling and do what instead? Live for themselves alone, wasting away in front of screens, only to die with no descendants, leaving no lasting mark on the world? Think about the kind of misery you're consigning these men to. Think about the catastrophic, probably fatal effect this would have on our country. You can't give up on propagating the species for a few decades and then pick it back up again like nothing happened. That doesn't work on any level, individually or societally. It is a recipe for despair and collapse. Am I saying that young men and women should accept the risk then and get married anyway? Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. That doesn't mean you should be reckless. I've already talked about many practical things you can do to mitigate your own risk so that it's not a roll of the dice. You should do all those things. Don't go into marriage blind, but don't run from it either. Even if you mitigate the risk to the extent possible, still there will be a risk. That's true, but here's the rub. All good things come with risk. The more worthwhile it is, the worse and more disastrous it will be if you fail. If you take on more responsibility, then your life will be more consequential, and the more consequential your life is, the more cataclysmic your failures potentially become. A married man with children lives a life of greater consequence than a single man with no children. There are more people depending on him. He has a greater stake in the future. This means that if things go sideways, it'll be a tragedy. If he screws up or his wife screws up or they both do, his life will be ruined, his children will be devastated, and the impact will reverberate down through the generations. This is what it means to live a high-impact, consequential life. These are the stakes. And yes, they are quite high. Now, sure, you can stave off that sort of catastrophe by staying by yourself, never going out on a limb, never taking any risk, never marrying, never having kids, never striving for anything great or meaningful in life. But then you're not avoiding failure and misery. You are guaranteeing it. You are ensuring that you never lose your family in a divorce by never having a family to lose in the first place, which is like ensuring that you never go bankrupt by being bankrupt to begin with. I'm not going to lose all my money because I'm going to stay broke. I beat the system. Not losing by having nothing to lose is a loss in itself. And I don't want that for anyone. It's not a path to happiness and prosperity for either you or society. It is a path to defeat, a preemptive and self-imposed defeat. And that is the worst kind of all.
So Matt finally gives us what is the meat of why he thinks marriage should be encouraged in spite of the risks involved. And for him, a lot of that has to do with, according to his perspective, the unimaginable amount of benefit that is possible, even if it's not, guaranteed. And a lot of that benefit has to do with continuing on your descendants, having your legacy continue, having the country being sustained and maintained by a thriving population, because obviously a descent in population is going to lead to the collapse of a country. So a lot of his arguments come down to that, the future, basically, a maintenance and sustenance of the future. Although most people who want to have kids don't have such lofty ideals for why they want to have kids, if they even have a reason to begin with, if they even planned on having kids. For me, that is I would, in full disclosure, say that I am an anti-natalist. For me, that is a very selfish goal to have in mind when trying to have kids. The fact that you want to prolong your own legacy or to sustain the country and all of these things do not seem like they are worth the suffering that bringing a life into existence is going to incur. The suffering that we are all very well aware of if we all have a natural tendency to underweight the suffering because we get adjusted to it. And again, I'm very tempted to get into the weeds of it. I could make an entire video on why I have my anti-natalist views. It's not something that I always had. But suffice to say, I think a lot of the arguments that Matt is making are going to resonate very well with a lot of people who do have some intention on, carrying on their bloodline, which is a natural instinct. And its nature itself is to propagate and to have offspring who we teach and all of these things. The fact that you might also be helping your country is yet another bonus for a lot of people who are more, nationalistically, who have a more nationalistic mindset. But I think he's preaching to the choir here, because people who do want that are exactly the people who do not need to be motivated to get into marriages. People, young men and young women who do not want to have kids or are on the fence of that even, I'm not sure how much this argument is going to resonate with them, because I think there has to be far more justification for why someone like myself, who's anti-natalist, or someone who just doesn't want kids because they find it, an unnecessary burden in their lives, to disregard those and go on to still have kids and marry.